Welcome to My Morning Cup, a podcast produced by Costa Media Advisors and brought to you by the generous support of the Tennessee Valley Authority. To learn more about TVA's impact on our community, follow TVA on Instagram at TVA and on Twitter X at TVA News. My Morning Cup, where we have interesting conversations with genuine people. I'm Mike Costa, your host. My guest this week is David Carroll. David is the anchor of Local 3's flagship 6 p.m. newscast, as well as their 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. newscast. David, welcome to My Morning Cup. Before we get into how you became the unofficial, or should I say official, media historian of Chattanooga, let me ask, what's in your morning cup?
I was afraid you would ask that. You've done, 110 shows or something
like
now?
that, yeah.
Has anyone ever been on My Morning Cup and confessed openly and publicly that they don't drink coffee?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good.
A couple. Roy Vaughn at Blue Cross Blue Shield is a Diet Coke guy.
I was afraid I would be the first one. Oddly enough, even though I did morning radio and TV for 10 years and raised 2 kids that I had to take to school in the mornings, I've never drank coffee.
Really?
I tried once. I was in McDonald's, and there was that aroma of whatever frozen coffee they have. And I just thought, oh my gosh, this is great. And I was seeing people just gulp it down, and it smelled so good. And so I said, I've got to have it. I was probably 35 years old. And I gulped it down, and my heart started like, So I said, I don't think coffee's for me at this point. Yeah. But I've just never gotten started.
Well, my little secret, and it's probably not a secret on this podcast, is I'm a decaf guy. I gave up caffeine probably 6 years ago.
I think McDonald's had caffeine. I think the ingredient.
Some of those things are just ridiculous. Yeah, you'll feel your heart jump out of your chest.
It was so good, though.
Yeah.
Never went back for that.
Yeah, I like the aroma. I like the flavor. I like the routine of preparing it, although preparing it now is a lot different. You know, you're not grinding beans. You're not putting all that together. I get a little Nespresso cup. I pop it in there, and it shoots right through, and it's a nice cup of coffee.
I'm sure. But I'm so glad that you answered in that way, because I thought, I'm going to get in there. I'm going to admit that I don't drink coffee. He's going to say, well, this was a mistake. Next.
Yes, next.
Bring in James Howard. Let's go.
So if you were doing mornings for 10 years, what was getting you going?
I think just the fun.
Just the fun?
That was both radio, primarily radio, actually. TV was sort of an accident. But being on the radio in the morning was just such a rush. You're the first one to get to work in the morning. You have 4 hours to just play and be creative. And back in that era, 1980s, I did a lot of like news parodies and jokes and bits and things. And you could do it on current events. If the president Reagan held a press conference the night before, I would record it and then splice it up and have him answer my silly questions, things like that. So I really didn't need anything to boost me. I looked forward to that creative blast every day.
You so loved what you were doing.
I did. And just the interaction with listeners, everything was live back then. Nothing was voice tracked. So if I wanted to have a little fun at Nancy Reagan's expense when she was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on China, I could start a fund, do a telethon on the radio and have, people call in and make donations. It was just a time, and thankfully, I had radio station management that allowed me in my early 20s to be that person. And, they didn't come in and say, stop doing that, or you just made a client angry or anything like that. So it was just a great deal of freedom and creativity. I loved it.
What a different business it is today. Because
very different.
You're right that creativity is missing, and it's the consolidation that has everyone with this cookie cutter pattern of here's what you need to do because it's working in Des Moines.
Right, and so much syndication now. You have many programs on the radio are not local. So I feel blessed and fortunate to have gotten into that field at a time when creativity was encouraged and allowed.
Is radio your first love?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
From the time I was 12 years old, I still remember that particular summer, discovering radio stations, discovering music, and just from that point on, I spent every ounce of energy trying to figure out how to be that guy on the radio.
Well, and that's where I want to go right now is to Bryan, Alabama. And radio's your first love. And so many of your peers who, whether they're in TV now or whether in broadcasting, grew up listening to that Clear Channel station from afar. And I would imagine for you, being the Braves fan that you are, WSB was a pretty big influence on that.
As far as sports is concerned, sure, I would listen to the Braves on WSB, the Reds on WLW, the Pirates on KDKA, on and on. So yeah, that AM radio Clear Channel thing was one thing, but the music, WLS in Chicago, and WOO in Fort Wayne, Indiana, all these stations, they have these incredible nighttime signals. I would hear these guys and just go, man, that's amazing. And, here in Chattanooga, we had some good radio stations too. There was a period in the 1970s when we had 3 top 40 stations competing head to head, and they were bringing in some big talent. So I grew up at a time when there was just some great people, frankly, to emulate, copy, and sort of model myself after.
So your family in Bryant was a prominent family from the standpoint that they owned the general store, the general merchandise store.
One of them. Well, there was more than one in Bryant, Mike. Yeah. we had competition. There were a few. But yeah, a very close-knit small community. Maybe 5 or 6 general stores, gas stations, a post office, no red lights. We were pretty much free to roam. But it was very close-knit, and having started on the radio when I was in 11th grade, working a weekend shift in South Pittsburgh, it was just really cool to go to school on Monday morning and, my classmates like, hey, I listened to you on the radio yesterday.
That is cool. And
probably swelled my ego far more than it should have. But that was quite a rush back then.
You have siblings?
Yes. One has passed away, but 2 older sisters.
2 older sisters. So were you the baby?
I was the baby by 10 years. And
wow.
I recommend that highly. Anybody out there who has yet to be born, if you can arrange it to have 2 older sisters, man, they treat you like the Hope Diamond. It was great.
You almost grew up as an only child or with 3 mothers.
Pretty much, and both sisters were out of the house by the time I was 7 or 8.
Yeah.
From the time I was in 1st or 2nd grade, I was both the only child and, frankly, one of the key employees of the store.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. When did they recruit you to come work in the store? How old were you?
You're going to think this story is either funny or sad. I'll leave it up to you. The store was the front of the building that was also our home. Or maybe I should describe that differently. Our home was in the rear of the store. But oftentimes when I was little, my parents would be busy running the store, and I would be in the living quarters watching TV. So I was growing up watching game shows and things during the daytime. And I made working in the store my own little game show. When I was old enough to do the adding machine in the cash register, I would be adding up someone's grocery, rip off the receipt, hand it to them and say, your grand total is $4.72. Congratulations. And my parents would just look at me like, man, this kid is different. But that was, I was sort of emulating what I was seeing on TV. And frankly, I would notice how hard my dad worked for a living, changing oil and repairing chainsaws and, changing people's tires, carrying these heavy bags of horse feed and stuff like that. And then I would see Bob Barker on TV with, not a hair out of place and, crisp white shirt, and he hadn't lost any of his fingers, in a chainsaw accident or anything like that. And I would just go, man, that is a cool way to make a living right there,
Yeah.
And so when people ask me my influences, they always think I'm going to say Walter Cronkite. And I'm like, well, actually Bob Barker.
Yeah, that's understandable.
He was cool.
Yeah, look at the number of game show hosts that came out of the news industry.
And radio, exactly.
And radio. Mm-hmm. Pat Sajak just retired. I remember I grew up in Memphis, and that's when Wink Martindale was a big deal, and Wink was a Memphis guy. So, that was – I can see how that could be your influence as a young kid.
And one thing I've observed over the years, a lot of us kids who grew up in rural areas, like many of the disc jockeys that I followed in Chattanooga, they didn't grow up in downtown Chattanooga or East Ridge or Brainerd or the suburbs. They grew up in Polk County. They grew up in Dalton. They grew up in Fort Payne. Many cases 40, 50 miles from Chattanooga like me, and we looked at this as the big city, where you could escape the rural atmosphere and become part of something supposedly bigger.
Well, we recently spoke with Darrell Patterson. Same thing.
Same thing.
McMinn County.
Yep.
I know the game shows and watching got you interested in broadcasting. You talked about your parents looking at you going, what's up with this kid? Was there anything in them that said, well, wait, we thought you'd take over the store, or were they encouraging of you?
My mom was encouraging. My dad couldn't figure me out, and I think only until maybe the last few years of his life did he kind of figure me out. But he was very much into me taking over the store, which I could have done. I've spent 10, 12 years almost every day in there growing up, and I was good with numbers. I would do a lot of the accounting, the bookkeeping. I always enjoyed math, and majored in business management in the local junior college there, or the area junior college. So that was the plan. The plan was for me to figure out the numbers game, keep things profitable, pay the bills, do the taxes, that sort of thing. And if I wanted to do radio as a side gig, a fun gig on weekends, he was okay with that. But he was quite surprised when I started working full-time in radio. He was like, seriously, you want to spend your life in one of those little tiny smoke-filled rooms? I'm like, yeah, I do.
Well, it's interesting you say that. My dad, in a similar fashion, could not understand how I was going to make a living.
Right.
You know, he was what I like to say, worried about me. You know, how are you going to do that? Mm-hmm. But you figure it out. So talk a little bit about what got you in the 11th grade mm-hmm. to start working at a radio station. I mean, you're at this point a broadcast junkie. You're listening and you're watching. What was the thing that drove you to go to South Pittsburgh and say, hey, I want a job?
Looking back on that, I had spent so much of my spare time practicing. Like, we subscribed to Newsweek magazine, and I would read the news articles, but I loved the ads. I loved pretending I was reading a radio commercial about, the new Chevy Impala or whatever was on a full-page ad in a Newsweek magazine. So I had practiced that into a tape recorder. I was trying to lose my Alabama accent as best as I could, trying to sound like Bob Barker and Dick Clark and all the people on TV who sounded, middle America. And around the time I was 15 or 16, my dad got me a motorcycle, which was really not a good idea, but he did it. And that motorcycle enabled me to visit the radio station in South Pittsburgh, about 15 miles away. And I got to be friends with some of the DJs, and I would hang out there every day. And eventually their Sunday afternoon guy quit suddenly, and I think they called me because they figured, maybe if we pay him to come one day a week, he won't bother us every day. And that's how it worked out.
What's interesting about that is how so many of your peers, same age group who came up broadcasting the same way, have a similar story. Mm-hmm. I either started calling into the radio station, not to win stuff, but to talk to the DJ about what they do. Or the radio station was, 5 miles away, and I'd ride my bike and hang out. And did they embrace you at that time, or were you just an annoying kid until they realized you were serious about it?
I think at first I was an annoying kid. I will admit to that. They were correct about that. Evidently, they saw something in me. And keep in mind, people think of a South Pittsburgh radio station as being, very small and no listeners. No, this was it was very successful. It had been on the air a long time, a family-run business, and they took pride in it. And they liked to sound like a somewhat smaller version, a local version, if you will, of the Chattanooga Top 40 stations. So I was doing basically what WFLI and WGOW, the Chattanooga stations, were doing, just in South Pittsburgh, 30 miles away. And after being on a few weeks, I think they thought I was doing a pretty decent job, and they would ask me to fill in during the summer for, the regular people and all that. So they were very good to me. And oddly enough, even after I got jobs full-time in Chattanooga doing mornings, I stayed over there doing that Sunday thing in South Pittsburgh for 6 years.
Really?
Because I just loved it. Yeah. And I could bring my records from home. I could do anything I wanted to do. And, as many radio station people will admit to you, one of the reasons you get into it is to, meet girls. So, and I was doing that. So kept going.
That's even better. One of the things that people forget about small local stations is they're the heartbeat of that community.
Absolutely.
They're that connection to the community. And even with the amount of consolidation that broadcast industry's had today, there's still a lot of mom and pop small town stations that remain the heartbeat of their community.
And I'm proud to say that particular station is still on the air today, still doing Swap and Shop every morning, which is as local can be, sponsored, sold out every day. So I'm very proud of that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're working there. You decide to go to junior college and major in business management.
Right.
At that point, had you not decided to pursue a broadcast career?
Well, after I had been on the radio in South Pittsburgh for a year, something happened. That was sort of life-changing for me. All my classmates had told me how good I was, and my mother and my sisters told me how good I was. And I was convinced all those people can't be wrong. I must be really good. So I skipped school one day, drove to Chattanooga, took a tape of myself to WFLI, and played it to the guy, and I'm thinking, who is he going to fire to make room for me? Because I'm good. And he put that tape in the player and started listening to me, and after every single thing I said, he stopped it and chewed me out.
Really?
And told me how I was speaking like I was speaking to an auditorium of people, when on radio you're supposed to be talking to a person. He was criticizing me for the cliches I was using, the late, great Elvis. He goes, I think people know he's dead. And after everything I said, he would just rip me a new one. And after maybe 3 or 4 sets, he rewound it, handed it back to me and said, come back and see me in about a year. And I remember thinking, that's a long time. When you're 16, a year is an eternity. Now it's just like that. But that, I won't say it broke me. At first it did. It just shocked me. But I said, well, I guess I'm not meant for radio. So I started focusing again on the schooling and the business management thing. But after a while, I realized that everything he said was true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like, you go, if you want to be a car mechanic, you should get a good mechanic to tell you what you're doing right and wrong. Well, this guy was telling me what I was doing wrong. And I started following his advice, and I did get better. So that rekindled my interest in radio.
He must have seen something in you, but wanted you to know that you had a lot more work to do.
And he may have recognized some cockiness that was not deserved.
Yeah.
So he brought me down a notch.
Do you remember who it was?
Oh, yes.
I won't ask you.
But I give him full credit. He turned me around.
But that may have been the best thing for you.
Absolutely. And when I get to talk to high school and college kids about broadcasting or whatever field they're wanting to get into, that's what I tell them. Find somebody who's good at it and make them be honest with you.
Yeah, because the scene almost sounds like something out of a Hollywood motion picture. Here's a kid, he saves up his $5 to drive to Chattanooga, and he's going to conquer the world.
I already had my show lined up. I was ready to go to work the next day. So that was a very valuable lesson.
So how'd you feel when you drove back home?
I was defeated at the time. I just remember thinking, wow, he must be wrong because everybody else says I'm great. But over a period of time, it became obvious he was right.
So what spurred you on? Because you could very easily have said, you know what, this isn't meant for me. I went after my dream. I got it pushed back into my face, and I'm going to run the store. And
I think I got better. I really do. I remember eventually when I did get into Chattanooga radio full time, I had a different program director, and he would review our performances by listening to our tapes. And he would say very honestly, okay, I have an A critique, a B critique, and a C critique. The A critique, well, I'll be nice to you. The B critique, I'll be a little tougher on you. And the C critique will make you cry, but it'll make you better. And I always opted for C. I said, bring it on.
Oh, he would give you a choice of which critique you get?
He says, if you can't handle it, I'll be nice to you. But if you want to get better, I'll make you better. And I needed to get better.
So you go back, you're 16, 17, you're still working in South Pittsburgh. What's your big break?
Probably the big break came when I was a year or two later. Let me do the math here, 18 or 19. I had started the same strategy at WFLI, which was the big 50,000 watt top 40 station here in Chattanooga that I just idolized. And I started bugging them all the time. And I would call them and I would visit them and hang out with them. And they had an all-night opening. And I thought, well, that's tough. I've never stayed up all night before, but it's a foot in the door. So I applied for that and got it. And soon they moved me to an evening, like nighttime shift, and then up the ladder a little bit. But that was probably the big break that led to mornings, which is where it is in radio.
How important, in your opinion, is it for someone to take something like that they're not sure they're going to like, number one, but it's in the field they want to get in the door, to make that compromise of, you know what, it's not exactly what I want, but boy, my foot's in the door.
It's so important. And did you ever know Randy Ross, who was at KZ106 and GOW? He's one of my favorite success stories, and he took what I did to a higher level. Randy was from Rossville. I think he went to Rossville High School before it merged and became Ridgeland. He was, just a good old boy. And he was determined to get on radio. So he would hang out at KZ106 when I was there. And he literally said, whatever y'all need to be done, I'm going to do. And we thought, we'll have a little fun with him. Like, well, the bathrooms need cleaned. I'll take care of it. And he did. He became the janitor, Mike. He was 18 or 19 years old, and he was the janitor. But he hung out at the radio station. He started rehearsing and practicing and going out on remotes and doing the things kids do. And long story short, he eventually became a station manager in Johnson City and did extremely well with his career. But I always tell people this was a kid who was serious when he said, I'll do anything, whatever you need to get in the door here.
And that translates to really any field.
Sure.
If you're interested in it, you've got to make some sacrifices or compromises to get your foot in the door, because not all these fields are easy to get into.
And now, occasionally we see young applicants in my current workplace who, you tell them in the beginning, well, you're going to have to do some late night work or early Saturday, Sunday morning work. Now, I don't get up early. So that lets you know pretty early on in the conversation, you're not going to make it in this business.
Well, what I always found interesting about the rookie reporters is, you mean I got to work Christmas?
Yes.
Yeah. Who do you think's going to work Christmas?
And any of us old timers who've been around a while, we paid our dues on many Christmas days.
Yeah.
I can assure you.
Yeah, there's a lot that you've got to do to earn your stripes, for lack of a better term.
Pay your dues.
So if you will, go through a bit. You start WFLI at nights. How much freedom do you have, and then what does that lead to?
You get a lot of freedom in that era, in the 1970s.
And also at night, I'm sure.
At night, you're encouraged to use your freedom. And when I was going to college at night in Rainsville, Alabama, 2 or 3 nights a week, 40-mile drive, I would listen to those radio stations we listed earlier, the AM Clear Channel stations. And I heard some great disc jockeys. And I'm not above saying, as most of us in radio are not above saying this, I would steal from them. I mean,
it's not stealing if it's out of the market, David.
That's the way I looked at it. But I mean, I was 19. I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, so I couldn't actually write comedy and things that well. But I would hear somebody do things or say things like, that might work in Chattanooga. And one night I heard a guy take a bath on the radio. And he just used sound effects, but he was acting the part. He was squeezing the rubber ducky. You heard water running out of the faucet. You heard splashing, the whole thing. And he was just creating that theater of the mind thing that I'm listening to some guy taking a bath on the radio.
Yeah. And I'm intrigued.
It sounded believable.
Yeah.
And he was afraid the station manager was going to come in and find, all that stuff. Well, I ripped that off, hook, line, and sinker. And little things like that, just got people's attention. Like, are you the guy that took the bath on the radio? We were talking about it at the school next day. So, and there were other little bits and things like that I would throw in there. But yes, creativity, humor, excitement, all that was encouraged, and that helped move me up the ladder.
And you're at FLI for how long?
About a year and a half.
And what's that lead to?
That, for whatever reason, maybe my dad's urging, I started accelerating the school thing and going to more night classes, which eliminated any chance of doing Monday through Friday radio. Did that for about a year and was working at the store during the daytime. So at that point, I was more into, I'm going to do this store, and radio is going to be my weekend side gig, moonlighting. And then one day, you're talking about breaks, WGOW called, and that was the competitor to FLI. Jerry Lingerfeld was station manager.
I didn't realize Jerry was station manager.
Owned by Ted Turner and run by Jerry Lingerfeld.
Yeah.
And Jerry called, and he had been familiar with me on the radio, and he said, this was like a Wednesday, he said, our morning guy just quit suddenly. We don't have anybody. Can you fill in for a couple of weeks on mornings? And I told my dad, again, we're living 35 miles away from Chattanooga. I said, Dad, starting tomorrow, I've got to be at WGOW at 5:30 in the morning, which means I'll need to leave here at 4:45, which means I'll need to wake up around 4:15. He said, what? And I said, you heard me. I got to start doing that tomorrow. It's just for a couple of weeks. And he said, you should call them right now and tell them you can't do it. I said, why would I do that? He says, you've never gotten up early in your life. I've had to wake you up and drag you and throw cold water on you and drag you out. You call them right now and tell them you can't do it. I don't know if he intended this or not, but it worked. It was like reverse psychology.
Yeah.
The moment he said that, I'm like, oh, yes, I can. Yeah. You're darn right I'm going to get up at 4:15.
And you're going to do something you love.
Yeah. And plus, I'm not going to disappoint WGOW. They want me to be on their airwaves even for a couple of weeks. That's an honor. So I did it, and they liked it so much they said, we're just going to stop our search. How about you do mornings full time?
Did you at all take that as your dad not being supportive of your choice to pursue broadcasting, or did you see it, as you said, more of a reverse psychology type? Well,
looking at it through the rearview mirror of time, I think he was honest. Because frankly, I would have probably said that to my sons.
Yeah.
Because I had the same experience with them. They were not early risers, and I had to cajole them into going to school every morning. So, yeah, it's very likely he was being honest. And frankly, as a dad of a, whatever I was then, 18, 19-year-old, I don't know that I would have wanted my son to drive from Bryan, Alabama to Chattanooga every morning at 4:45 or whatever. So he was probably being sincere, at least to a large degree. But it worked.
Yeah.
It motivated me, and I was determined to do a good job. I think in the back of my mind, I was hoping they might say, hey, maybe you're not just a temporary guy. Maybe we can just put you in there. And they did, and it worked out great.
So they put you in mornings permanently?
Mm-hmm. After a couple of weeks, they said, we're not going to search anymore. It's your job if you want it. I'm like, yeah.
That's great. So the top 40 stations in Chattanooga were FLI, GOW, and was SK?
No, WDXB, which is long defunct now. But those three, for a period in the 70s, were just going at it. It was great. They were all trying to outdo the other.
You're 18, 19, 20 years old. You're doing mornings on WGOW, one of the top radio stations. You a little full of yourself at that point?
Oh, no doubt about it. Oh, gosh. I wish I could go back and repair some of the just arrogance that I surely exhibited at that time. And a funny story that I got to tell you, because on this same track, I was on WGOW mornings for 7 or 8 months, and Ted Turner sold the station. And, anytime, as you've gone through, there's an ownership change, all of the current employees look at each other like, we're toast.
Yeah.
They're going to bring in their own people. And so I was concerned and figured, well, back to the store. Turns out the new owners wanted to put me on mornings on the FM station they were signing on, which at that time was a beautiful music dentist office station that they were going to turn into KZ106. And so Jim Wood, the operations manager, said, David, we've been listening to you on mornings on the AM, and starting on August, when we signed this new station on, we want you to be the morning guy on FM. And I remember thinking, oh, no, they're demoting me to FM?
Yeah.
Because at that time, FM was not the place to be.
No one listened to FM. It was all AM.
Well, and the music stations were all kind of hard rock, and all the announcers did was say, you've been listening to Uriah Heep, and before that we played Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. That's not me. And I thought, no, man, you're putting me on FM. They're like, we think it's going to be okay. And it became KZ106, and yeah, they're still doing all right.
Did you have the same freedom that you?
Yeah, and that's what I told them too. I said, I'm not an FM guy. I do goofy jokes and funny news. They said, just do it on FM. So I did.
So what year was that KZ?
August 19th, 1978.
1978. So KZ's been on the air going on 50 years.
Yeah, and I think they're going to be all right. And they're still playing the songs I did, as I kid them about all the time.
And I believe this is Scott Chase's 40th year.
He just celebrated 40.
Yeah.
He started about a year after I left.
Wow, that's incredible.
And he's a good radio man.
So you're in Chattanooga radio, really at the height.
Yes.
Of radio. Mm-hmm. What gets you to TV? or is there more radio?
That's really, I'll give you the answer to that. I was on KZ doing mornings for about 4.5 years, doing well. The station was always number one. My show was number two because there was a guy named Luther on the radio down the dial.
I'm not familiar with that.
And Luther would thrash me pretty well, as he did everybody else. But considering the fact that I was up against a giant, I was holding my own. But after about 4.5 years, Channel 12 had an opening for their morning show, which at that time was an opinion show, call-in show. And Harry Thornton was the originator of that show. He was a very Rush Limbaugh. He was Rush Limbaugh before Rush Limbaugh. But he was very popular. The show was very popular. They had gone through some changes after Harry left the show, and they had an opening. And since I was a rock and roll DJ with a beard, they assumed I was somewhat liberal and that I would play a good counterpoint to the conservative female co-host. I didn't know all this at the time. They just asked me if I would host the morning show. And I thought they meant for a day, but they meant from here on out. So I did it. I took that job. And it turns out both the co-host, Helen Hardin, and I were somewhat conservative in our views for that time. So generally, I had to play the liberal, kind of like pro wrestling. You have
you had to have both sides for the show to work.
Good guy, bad guy. Yeah. And did that for a few years.
Yeah. So you had a beard.
Had a beard. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Before Paul Barris, I had the beard.
Did you give him yours?
He stole the idea.
How long were you at DEF?
4 years, and a new manager came in and yanked that show off the air. And thankfully, Channel 3 was starting up a 5:30 p.m. newscast at that same time, which was new for that era. Mm-hmm. And they needed somebody to start that off, and I was fortunate enough to be ready and available at that time.
So this is 1987, and at that time, most local news stations are doing basically the 6P and the
6 and 11.
And Channel 3 comes out and says, we're going to do a 5:30P.
Yep. And that was revolutionary for that time because everybody was running Cosby, Three's Company, some sort of reruns during that afternoon pre-news hour. And 5:30 started in 87. Channel 9 followed a few months later doing the same sort of thing. And since then, we've been expanding and expanding and expanding.
Oh, yeah. All the way to 4 p.m. at this point. Now, I was on the other side of broadcasting. I was on the sales and management side, and I went from radio to television. And it was a very difficult transition from a sales standpoint. How about from a talent standpoint? You're doing radio all these years, and all of a sudden you're doing television. How intrusive was that camera, and is it a different skill set?
It was the biggest loss for me was control, because when you're on the radio doing your own show, you're handling all the technology, the equipment. If something sounds good, you're responsible for that. If something sounds bad, you're responsible for that. And I learned quickly in TV, I had no control. There are people behind the camera, the control room, the transmitter site, any of whom could make me look great or make me look like a fool. Not intentionally, but, just things break down, mistakes are made. So losing that control was difficult at first. As far as comfort with the camera, that's a skill that you have to acquire. I still feel like I'm working on that now, just because it's unnatural. You're supposed to be looking into this monstrous piece of equipment and pretend you're speaking to a person. It's just not natural. That's not something you do. And you can quickly identify the people on TV who do it well and those who don't. Some people just have the knack. So it's definitely a skill I'm still working on.
Well, and I think viewers can identify that right away. That someone who's good jumps out of the box.
Yes.
Right at you.
It's a natural trait, and people who are nervous or uncomfortable with it, that shows.
Now, you said earlier that when you were a kid growing up and watching the game shows that Bob Barker was really an idol. Yeah. So you get into television. At that point, are you going, watch out, Bob?
I was pretty certain that my game show opportunities had passed. But I'll tell you who I did really admire and model myself after as far as doing live TV. And I say live TV because reading off a prompter and doing live breaking news, two different things. And I really had some great opportunities at Channel 3 early on to do live, unscripted TV because we had some weather events. And sometimes we were on the air for hours during these massive snowfalls during my first few years at Channel 3. And when you're a new person on TV and you're trying to establish some credibility and comfort, again, you have to go to those people that you've seen who do it well. I thought Bob Costas was amazing.
Yeah.
I thought Brent Musburger, the sportscaster, was amazing. I thought on TV, Tom Brokaw was smooth, Brian Williams, all these people. But you see these people who can function well on TV for literally hours with no script, just having to bounce off current events and react to things that are happening instantaneously. In breaking news stories, to not sensationalize or go beyond what you actually know to be true. But those were the people I kind of called upon in my head, like, what would Bob Costas do in a case like this? I mean, he's known for sports, but I think he could do anything. And the same goes for those others. So that helped me a lot.
Did you have any mentors as you were coming up, local mentors as you were working?
I've got to say Luther.
Yeah.
And there are many others, but Luther stands out just in the sense that he basically gave a master class every day in relating to listeners and making a difference in their lives. And I would ask him occasionally, and he was not comfortable being asked these questions, but I would say, Luther, how come you're Luther and the rest of us are just us? What sets you apart? And he would be reluctant to pat himself on the back, but he would break it down to, David, we play the same music. All of us play the same music. We play the same commercials, but it's what we do between those songs that sets us apart. And I try to make a difference in somebody's life every day, every time I speak. Whether it's finding their dog or telling them about some big event coming up or telling them to avoid a certain area that's slippery or whatever it may be, I've got to affect someone's life. And I thought, wow, that makes it sound easy. Why haven't the rest of us figured that out? But he was definitely a mentor in that the kindness, the reliability, you knew he was going to show up. For 20 years or so, I was his fill-in, and I made a little extra money every time I filled in for him. And I tried to get him to take more vacation or sick days. He wouldn't do it. No. I mean, here was a guy who worked 50-something years. He was taking 2 weeks a year, bingo, never called in sick. But the fact that you could count on him. You knew he was going to be there. You knew what you were going to get when you turned on his program. He was just an amazing role model for me.
I read somewhere that Luther was the only on-air personality who announced the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the attacks of 9/11.
60 years apart.
At the same station.
Same time, same station. It's interesting because during those years that I filled in for him, the station management would take me out to lunch about every 5 years because they thought Luther was going to retire. When he turned 65, they took me to the Loft restaurant. David, we think Luther's going to retire. Would you be interested? I'm like, yeah, let me know. When he turned 70, they took me to lunch at someplace, Town and Country. Well, David, Luther just turned 70. We think this may be it. Are you interested? Sure, let me know. And it finally got to the point where they didn't bother anymore. Like, he's going to go till he passes, which he did.
So did you develop that relationship when you were at WDEF Television, or did you have one before?
No, when I was at DEF Television, I would just go hang out with him occasionally or help him do a commercial or something like that. So we had a rapport, and that's how I started filling in for him. But even after I went to Channel 3, they were very good about letting me fill in for him.
That is a great advantage. So with Luther, Chattanooga's grown quite a bit since Luther passed.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I don't think a lot of people who are, obviously people who are new to town, realized the effect he had on this town and on broadcasting.
Oh, immense. And he was on the radio at a time when morning radio was a necessity. We have other options to get our information now. We didn't in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and so forth. And he could literally tell Chattanoogans to turn their headlights on in the fog, and all of a sudden you'd be driving down Macaulay Avenue, and boom, lights started coming on. He would give you tips about letting some air out of your tires to improve your traction. All of a sudden, you've got people up and down Brainerd Road pulling over, letting air out of their tires. Nobody has that kind of influence anymore, and they never will.
Yeah, it's also spread out now with so many different options out there. But this podcast is not about Luther; it's about David Carroll today. So I want to get back to you launching your television career. You get over to WRCB. Mm-hmm. You're doing some fill-in work with Luther. Where do you go from there? Is it you're doing the 5:30? Go through how your progression.
Well, first off, I'm hired by Tom Toller, who, if there was a Mount Rushmore of local TV people, he'd be up there. He's just solid as a rock. My news director was Lee Meredith, another solid guy.
I know Lee.
I'm co-anchoring with Cindy Sexton, who's kind of a big deal. She's been, just a huge asset to my life.
Did she come before or after you?
She was there a couple years before me. Okay. And in fact, I called her before I made the move. I'm like, am I making the right move? Yeah, come on in. The water's fine. So she was a big help to me. But I'm working with, just so many great people. And they help mentor me and kind of hold my hand as I'm getting into the world of TV news, which I had never intended to do. That was just, nothing I ever had aspired to. So I'm learning on the job, making mistakes on the job, doing a lot of live hits, as we say, going out in the field and dealing with a satellite truck and all those new toys at the time. And eventually moved into the 6 o'clock role about 20 years ago, and it's just been an amazing one. I've lost count to 37 years so far.
37 years at WRCB.
It's a great company.
Did you ever imagine when you were that little kid in the back of the house watching Bob Barker that you'd be doing television news?
No, never. And oddly enough, I was a fan of TV news at the time. I knew every reporter on the networks. In those days, CBS Evening News would come on and they'd say, with Terry Drinkwater in Los Angeles, with, so Bruce Morton in Washington. And I'd memorize all these reporters and see the ones that I thought were good and all that. But no, I never put myself into that.
Back when you were a kid, did you ever get the tape recorder and do bits yourself or pretend you were doing a stand-up or something like that?
As close as I got to that as far as a broadcast thing would be basketball games. I would go to my junior high school and high school's basketball games with a tape recorder and do the play-by-play. Not well, but I would attempt it. And so football, basketball, things like that. And I never really aspired to be a sports person, but that was a live event that was happening, and it gave me an opportunity to practice reacting to live coverage.
A lot of people we talk to on this podcast kind of fell into their careers, but there's also a certain group who are very focused on where they're going. And broadcasters tend to be in that because you get bit by the bug early. But you adapt like you did with radio and television into what you end up doing. So you've been at WRCB 34 years, and I'm curious from your standpoint, having been there 37 years and with the success Chattanooga's had over the last quarter century, what do you think are some of the most important things that really put Chattanooga on the current map?
If I had to list something right at the top, it would be the aquarium.
Yeah.
That to me was the biggest turnaround. Raising my kids here, one was born in 87, one was born in 90. I look back and the 80s, in my view, wouldn't have been as good a time to raise kids in this town. Downtown was really nothing to brag about. We didn't have that many clean, enjoyable places to take kids to run in the park, like Coolidge Park, the River Park, that sort of thing. So all this stuff that came right after the aquarium, River Park, Coolidge Park, Finley Stadium, AT&T Field, the aquarium, IMAX, Creative Discovery Museum, all this stuff went boom in the 90s. My kids were 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. Suddenly, we could go anywhere in downtown Chattanooga, and there was something fun for them to do. And I just think that, to me anyway, was the big turnaround.
So we've talked to a number of people about the aquarium, and I know, because I didn't live here at the time, that some people thought it was the greatest idea ever, and others poo-pooed it.
Oh, yeah.
From a news standpoint, what was being said in the newsrooms of what are they going to do downtown?
When the plans for the aquarium were being approved, let's say, or debated and then approved, I was doing the opinion morning show on Channel 12. And the majority of callers opposed it. This big fish tank that's going to be, such a white elephant for downtown Chattanooga. Nobody's going to go to that. They go to big cities for that. It was amazing the amount of opposition. And one of the coolest things about my early news career at Channel 3 is I got an interview with Jack Lupton, which was impossible. Now, Jack Lupton was the guy who put $30 million of his own change to make this happen. And everybody was afraid of him. You know, he was Daddy Warbucks.
Yeah.
He was the man. The politicians were intimidated by him. And they were having some sort of function to break ground for something at the aquarium. And I guess being kind of young and inexperienced, I had the gall to walk up with him with a microphone and camera and start talking to him. And everybody's looking at me like, that's Jack Lupton. Huh?
You can't do that.
And so he started talking. And so for years, we had the only known video of Jack Lupton speaking into a microphone. But I was in awe of him because he was this guy who had the power to do what the politicians were either unable or afraid to do. And I give him a lot of credit for where we are today.
It's almost like you did know what you didn't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, what do you mean I can't talk to him? I'll go up and talk to him.
To this day, I'll go up to anybody. All they can do is say no. You know.
But that's a great lesson for a lot of people who get intimidated, whether it's talking to someone or applying for a job or doing something. Just go do it. What's the worst thing that could happen?
Exactly.
They say no.
I have no fear of that whatsoever. And I try to tell young reporters, just keep that camera rolling. You never know.
Yeah. I've got a couple more questions for you. And one of them is, and I alluded to this in the introduction, the official Chattanooga media historian. What drove you to start writing books and documenting this rich history of broadcasting in Chattanooga?
First thing was Facebook. I was not an early adopter of Facebook, but I remember I was trying to get in touch with some of my old radio friends for one reason or another. And one of them said, you know how you can find them without having to, go through all these crazy searches? They're on Facebook. So 2 or 3 years after daily admonishments of my children about get off Facebook, what a waste of time that is. Suddenly I'm on it and they're reminding me what a waste of time it was. But that kind of helped build my contacts, as you might say, people I knew and people that I was just getting to know. And I started posting old pictures that I had collected and other people had collected on photo albums on Facebook of early broadcasting. And people just went nuts. And at the same time, my work colleague, Bill Markham at Channel 3, brought me a book that he had purchased somewhere of Nashville broadcasting. And he said, you could do that with Chattanooga. And I said, you know what? I think I could. Between the pictures I have and the ones I can accumulate, I think I could. So I contacted the publisher. They said, sure, give it a try. And I will give a lot of credit to you, the people at Channel 12, the people at radio stations around town. Even though I was a Channel 3 guy, all of you opened your doors and your libraries, your picture storage, and said, sure, use whatever you want. So I had access to old pictures from every media outlet and put it into a book, and it was a smash. 15 years later, it's still in stores, it's still selling. And it sort of launched my side career of doing some books.
And you also do a newspaper column, don't you?
58 papers. I'm very proud of that. I've been doing that for about 10 years now, a weekly column. And it's in smaller papers in and around the Chattanooga area, as well as Johnson City, Oak Ridge, Marietta. I'm leaving some out, Gwinnett County, Georgia. Anyway, it's built a nice little following.
And what's the focus of the column?
Mostly humor. I try to keep it light.
Yeah.
It's probably not a good idea for me to talk politics.
Probably not. How about your radio show?
Did that for 7 years on the Brewer media station, the Vinyl Express, and did 350 shows, the stories behind the songs. I miss it terribly. It was just one of those things that I sort of did and kind of ran out of ideas, I guess, themes out of 350. But people still talk to me about that, and I was very proud of it.
If you miss it, it sounds like a podcast, David.
If it weren't for the music.
if it were, well, that's a hard thing to do, a music podcast when you don't necessarily have the rights to it.
When you don't have the rights to the music.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I get to my last question, I do want to remind our listeners who makes all of this possible. And it's a huge thank you to the Tennessee Valley Authority for sponsoring My Morning Cup. You can follow TVA on social media to learn more about its multifaceted mission of service and visit TVA.com/do good here to explore exciting TVA career opportunities. All right, David, last question, and it's my standard last question. What would you tell that 25-year-old David Carroll, probably been working in radio 8 years at that point, is important for a happy life?
Just doing something that you love and doing it as best you can. Trying to help those who come in behind you. I try to be a good influence. At my age now, almost everybody I work with is younger, in some cases a good bit younger. So you try to be a good influence on them. Show up, be prepared, be dependable, be honest, and try to exceed expectations. That's whenever someone tells me, for instance, sometimes I speak to a group about the books or whatnot, and they'll often say, wow, I see you on TV, but I didn't realize you had a personality. and I go, okay, I've got to work on that if I'm not showing my personality. But if I'm being told that I exceeded someone's expectations, I'm like, okay, job well done. You got to keep doing that.
Yeah, and you said a lot of important things there, but one of them really jumps out to me is passion.
Oh, yeah.
You've obviously got a passion for what you're doing, and it may take you away from what the family business is or where people think you're going to go. But if you pursue that passion, life's a lot easier.
It is, and I often tell people how blessed I am to be in my 60s doing basically what I wanted to do when I was 12.
Yeah.
Just talk into a microphone, entertain people, inform people. There are various ways to do it, but there aren't many people who can say that, and I'm really fortunate.
That is fortunate. Well, you do it well, and we're very lucky to have you doing it in Chattanooga. I really appreciate you taking the time to come in and talk about it today, David.
My pleasure, and maybe I'll try some coffee before I come back.
Well, at this point, don't. You've got a streak going.
I guess you're right.
Yeah. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to My Morning Cup, a podcast by Costa Media Advisors. If you liked this episode, please share it with a friend. I release a new episode each week, so be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.